The focus of today is a topic that for many is the bane of your existence as a Spanish language learner. Prepositional placement and the construction of prepositional relative clauses or prepositional questions. One of the most consistent problems that native English speakers confront when learning Spanish is the mental block that emerges when we start using more complex grammatical structures in Spanish. One of the very last hurdles to comfortable fluency is the correct construction of prepositional relative clauses and prepositional questions. For me, evidence of an advanced level of Spanish communication is the correct construction of prepositional relative clauses and prepositional questions. This entails the correct placement of the preposition in the Spanish sentence. And this takes an understanding of the fundamental differences between Spanish and English with regard to prepositional placement. Understanding the relationship between the preposition and the relative pronoun. There are those that can construct prepositional relative clauses and prepositional questions correctly, and those who can't. It's an obvious marker of distinct levels of communication in Spanish. It's a clear tell, if you will. So to master this skill, I want you to take part in a thought experiment. I want you to imagine yourself as a guest at a highly formal dinner party. Bear with me here. I'm not the role-playing type myself when it comes to learning languages, but once you see my point, it will fundamentally change the lens through which you understand Spanish. So returning to the dinner, we're in England, let's say late Victorian England. Obviously English is being spoken all around you as you hobnob with other elites. I want you to think about the form of English you're hearing. A very refined and, to our ears at least, formal English. Imagine that you're trying to fit in, trying to feign your aristocratic heritage. What effect would your English take? Could you feign this formalized speech? Could you play the role, ever so briefly, of 19th century English gentry? What speech patterns would you use to play this role? I'm not referring to putting on an accent here. Think grammatical structures. Think speech patterns. One of the easiest ways to sound more formal in English is by focusing on the way we construct our prepositional relative pronouns. Returning to the dinner, you're partaking in light conversation with a guest, and you ask, "Who did you give the gift to?" How might you take a sentence like this, inhabiting your role, and change it to make yourself seem more aristocratic, more overtly pretentious, more snobbish? Maybe something like this. To whom did you give the gift? In order to start grasping the finer elements of advanced Spanish, you must begin to restructure your approach to Spanish through English itself. We have to change our mental maps, and I'm referring to here when we're translating. I'm very well aware that this is a taboo in foreign language learning. The majority of teachers would say, "Don't translate, think in Spanish." I'm a realist. We all know translating to a certain extent is inevitable. The problem isn't that we translate, it's how we translate. We need to think like a snob. This is an idea that I will return to many times in this video. Oh, I just used a perfect example. This is an idea that I will return to. Play your role. How might you change this to sound more formal? This is an idea to which I will return. The highly formalized form in English is the common form in Spanish. This is why I want you to restructure your English before engaging in Spanish. So a sentence like, "This is an idea to which I will return," in Spanish is, "Esta es una idea a la que regresaré." It's the same. This will be the focus of this video. Try this sentence. "That is the restaurant I met you in." Being a snob, this becomes the more refined, "That is the restaurant in which we met," which is the Spanish, "Ese es el restaurante en el que nos conocimos." Why does the native English-speaking brain have so much difficulty getting comfortable with the more formal construction? Or more importantly, why do we seem to have this choice in English between two forms that sound distinctly different? What is happening here? The more formal and common sentence structures we looked at earlier are examples of the difference between prepositional fronting and prepositional stranding. These terms refer to two different ways of structuring sentences involving preposition placement, usually occurring in questions and relative clauses. Prepositions are those little words we use to show direction, location, or time in relation to nouns or pronouns. At, on, to, by, about, etc. Relative clauses are introduced by relative pronouns. The words who, whom, whose, which, and that. They connect a noun or a pronoun in the main clause to a dependent clause. Okay, enough technical jargon. Prepositional fronting occurs when the preposition is placed before the object, the relative pronoun. That is the restaurant in which we met. As opposed to prepositional stranding, which is the term for a preposition occurring somewhere other than immediately before the object. In our example, that is the restaurant we met in. See how the little preposition is stranded at the end? Whereas in the more formal sounding sentence, it comes before or fronts the relative pronoun which. That is the restaurant in which we met. Prepositional fronting is also common in questions. Look at the difference between "To whom do I owe an apology?" and "Who do I owe an apology to?" For many native English speakers, it's simply not natural to think about placing prepositions before the relative pronoun, because prepositional stranding has become our default setting in English. And we will soon see this creates problems for the native English speaker when learning Spanish. We like to put our prepositions after the object. This is what the English lexicographer H.W. Fowler, when discussing preposition placement, referred to as the instinct for putting them late. Them in this case referring to prepositions. Is this something unique to English? No, but it is very rare in world languages. Some Germanic languages, like Dutch and Scandinavian varieties, incorporate prepositional stranding, but interestingly, not standard German. There are a few African languages that use it, but other than that, it's exceptionally rare. But most relevant to our discussion here is the fact that, other than in some North American dialects of French, prepositional stranding is not a feature of Romance languages. Latin does not exhibit prepositional stranding, and this would have a huge impact on English. Why? Because prepositional fronting was championed by grammarians that wanted to mimic the perceived purity of Latin as much as possible. Prepositional stranding thus diverged from that purity and started to be perceived as a vulgar, uncultured form. As early as the late 17th century, this distinction between the common prepositional stranding and its more refined, sophisticated counterpart became standardized in schools. And over the following centuries, this distinction between the common and formal form would continue. Remember, this was the era in which educational systems were emerging and texts used in these environments were becoming standardized. In Robert Lowe's 1762 textbook, A Short Introduction to English Grammar, he wrote that placing the preposition before the relative is more graceful, as well as more precipitous, and agrees much better with the solemn and elevated style. This isn't to say there wasn't a backlash to this reverence for prepositional fronting. Many grammarians pointed out the absurdity of trying to Latinize English. Famously, the excessively rigid adherence to the formal form led Winston Churchill to quip, "This is the sort of English up which I will not put." This was a man so devoted to the purity of the English language that his speeches famously tried to incorporate words only derived from Old English as opposed to Latin. He believed these Old English words would have more of an emotional impact on the public. An interesting approach given English derives roughly 60 to 70% of its words from languages other than Old English. For Churchill, purity wasn't making English more like Latin, but returning it to its roots in all its free prepositional glory. Our English today is still shaped by these debates. The disparagement of prepositional stranding continues in some circles, although its acceptance has increased substantially even since I was in school. A lot of baby boomers and Gen Xers still remember the "never end a sentence with a preposition" demand from our English teachers. Older generations were exposed to the formal prepositional placement form, and although it was thought of as highly formalized and often mocked for its pretentiousness, it was still something people from older generations understood. That being said, we feel more comfortable with the familiar quality of the free or stranded preposition. It feels authentic as opposed to the more formalized structure that feels a bit forced, a bit foreign in a way. So while the use of the stranded preposition has become more and more acceptable and makes English the beautifully malleable language that it is, I want you, the Spanish learner, to take a side in this debate. I want you to be a staunch proponent of the formal English form that sees prepositional stranding as vulgar. At least, I want you to feel this way while you're approaching your Spanish learning. Why? Because this is going to help you structure your Spanish correctly. When native English speakers start to communicate in Spanish, we've become so accustomed to placing the prepositions after the object that when we need to think about the preposition before the object, it can lead to a long pause while you try and reconfigure the sentence in your mind. I'm sure every Spanish learner has experienced this. It's very frustrating. This confusion exists for native Spanish learners of English as well. I teach English to native Spanish speakers, and the prepositional stranding that they hear and read in English frustrates them to no end. Remember, Latin had no prepositional stranding. My students just can't understand why the preposition is moving around. It seems so arbitrary. I tell my native Spanish-speaking English students that they actually have an advantage when it comes to constructing prepositional relative pronouns and relative clauses in English, because their default setting is the formal style in English. The formal form is very similar to the Latin construction, meaning it's similar to the Spanish construction. If my students go with their instinct, they will still be correct. It might sound formal, but it will be understood. On the other hand, in English we have two choices: the formal prepositional fronting style and the common prepositional stranding style. The native English speaker is at a disadvantage when it comes to constructing prepositional relative pronouns in Spanish, because the default setting for them in English is prepositional stranding. They will be wrong grammatically if they go with their gut instinct, and the sentence they're trying to construct simply won't work. It's frustrating, I know, but this is why we must get into the mindset of a snob. If we don't, we'll be stuck with the stranded preposition, and this gets us nowhere. We'll constantly pause in our sentences. We'll try to reorder the sentence in our mind, figure out where the preposition goes, and fall completely out of the flow of the conversation. We all know this feeling. Only think in prepositional fronting, never in prepositional stranding. John is the man Ginny fell in love with. This becomes, John is the man with whom Ginny fell in love. In Spanish, John es el hombre con quien Ginny se enamoró. Do you see the similarities in the more formal style of prepositional fronting and Spanish? Let's look at another sentence. Who are you speaking about? Formalize this. About whom are you speaking? The Spanish? ¿De quién estás hablando? ¿De quién? About whom? Okay, what I'm going to say next is very important. When inhabiting this snobbish role, take it to the extreme. Even if the formal construction sounds too over the top, do it anyway. The more absurd, the better. So a sentence like, they didn't know what they were looking at, becomes, they didn't know at what they were looking. This looks ungrammatical, it seems ridiculous, but this is exactly how we need to think for our Spanish relative pronouns to make sense. No sabían a lo que miraban. The more absurd, the better. Your Spanish will greatly benefit. Don't worry about if this sounds pretentious. It doesn't translate into Spanish, this pretentiousness. It doesn't sound in any way snobbish in Spanish. In Spanish, there is no other option. So, who did you arrive with becomes, with whom did you arrive? ¿Con quién llegaste? My love, what are you dreaming about? Take this one to an absurd level. Inhabit your role. My love, about what are you dreaming? Try this in Spanish. Now, remember, this one's tricky because of the preposition we use with the Spanish dream, con. Mi amor, ¿con qué estás soñando? This last example reminds me to mention one last thing with regard to mastering prepositional placement. Spend time studying the verbs that always require a specific preposition. Remember the verbs that take a, for instance, like ayudar a, enseñar a, asistir a. Remember the verbs that take de, like divertirse de o quejarse de. The verbs that take in, pensar in, confiar in. It's so important for your Spanish to spend extra time memorizing these verbs and their corresponding preposition, because you won't be able to construct the prepositional relative pronoun correctly without remembering the preposition that goes with the verb you're going to use. I would say there's around 30 to 35 important verbs that always take a specific preposition that you do need to memorize. So let's use a few of these in some practice examples. The prepositional stranding, my love, what are you thinking about, becomes the prepositional fronting, my love, about what are you thinking? Mi amor, ¿en qué estás pensando? Now I'm bringing this up because we need to remember that you pensar en algo. You think about something. To express that about, we use in. Here's another example. We have the prepositional stranding example. The situation that you're complaining about has no solution. See how about is stranded there after the object? The prepositional fronting would be the situation about which you are complaining has no solution. And in Spanish, la situación de la que te quejas no tiene solución. Quejarse is always used with de. You have to complain about something. Quejarse de. So to conclude, to take your Spanish to the next level, you must become comfortable constructing prepositional relative pronouns. And to do this, you need to think formally in English first. If you do, you will see that the construction of prepositional relative clauses and prepositional questions becomes much easier for you. Change your mental map. See the Spanish language through a new, highly formalized lens. You must be a staunch supporter of prepositional fronting, and view prepositional stranding like you were an 18th century grammarian decrying its impurity. Play the role. Be the snob at the dinner party. Also remember that no matter how absurd the formality sounds to your native English ears, go with it. Take formality to an extreme, almost comic level. If you do, your Spanish will be correct more times than not. Thanks for watching.